we look a lot at the human networks that make an organization function that are sort of hidden underneath the org chart on the wall. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term of strong ties and weak ties inside of networks. And your strong ties are, it's kind of self-evident, like your closest workmates or your friends in the building. And the weak ties often are the result of your strong ties connections, right? And it's not a value judgment. It's just saying, if I'm a strong tie with Shay and she's a strong tie with Christina and I become a weak tie. And oftentimes, if you map how work gets done in a normal, go back 2 years, it's oftentimes through those weak tie networks, because I can quickly go to Shay and say, I'm thinking about this thing. And she goes, oh, you need to talk to Christina. And then Christina may develop a strong tie out of that or not. Doesn't really matter. The point is, these 6 weak ties will become the work team and we'll get something done on a project basis. And in a very measurable way, when you go into a remote world, strong ties get tripled down on and weak ties can fade very quickly, because now I'm not going to bump into Christine in the hallway after Shay and I have coffee. It just physically doesn't happen that way, right? And so you overburden strong ties and we end up under leveraging weak ties, which I think is one of the sort of upstream effects of the burnout that's happening over the last 2 years. And it's not through people being evil, that we just literally don't know who to go to. So we keep going to the same people over and over.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for bringing that up. I love network theory. It's where I spend a lot of my day and my time thinking through. And that's absolutely what we've started to see. When you're in that remote environment, you don't run into people in the hallway. You don't see people or have those connections. And you're not deliberately maintaining some of those weak tie connections. You're not making sure that you're reaching out. And that often is where you start to cross different identity groups, different backgrounds, different ideas. That's where you're seeing a lot of that innovation come forward. And Chris, something that I know you and I have talked a lot about is how you can build some structures around communication processes and communication cadence in a way that can help support and build some of the opportunity to maintain those weak ties. You want to touch on that for a sec?
Yeah, I will. And if it's okay, I'll throw up a little whiteboard here, because otherwise I'll talk with my hands too much. And this is an observation here as I'm doing this that's anecdotal, is that I think a lot of those strong ties there's a lot of homophily inside of those, right? Just human nature kicks in there and we get that. I think those more inclusive networks come as knock-ons of those. And so I think this will, in some organizations, we'll see sort of a threat to a more inclusive organization, taking away sort of creative thinking around communication, which obviously folks like that are on a call like this are thinking deeply about. But so one of the realities of the special operations world where I grew up was, Shay, I'm seeing you. Can you give me a thumbs up if that's coming through? Great. We were this big structured thing like this, right? And we had, small units down here, like any other big organization. And so you lived in these very tight sort of siloed things, right? And when the world was static, that was fine, because there were costs to this, right? But just to accomplish the mission, essentially a decision would get made up here. One of the teams down here would get selected to do it, and then you would detach and go do your operation, and you would come back in, right? So cross-functionality from a coordination and information sharing and even a cultural lens really was not a top-of-mind issue. All of that existed here. This is where my culture and knowledge exchange needs to happen, or inside of my vertical. I need to make sure I'm aligned with my boss and their boss, et cetera. And this is a very homogenous community as well. So you could see yourself quite literally in this person here as much as you could in this person here or this person here. You didn't have to seek out, I don't see myself represented, so I'm going to seek out different mentorship, right? Which we can return to when we push towards a more transparent communication model that ended up really opening up pathways that we had never really considered before. But in the information age, what happened was we recognized there's all these little problems all around the world happening all at once. And so we've got to detach these teams, and this one's going to go here, this one's going to go here, this one's going to go here, et cetera. So we ended up distributed around the world, and similar to what's happened over the last 2 years, we lost the hallway effect, right? And all the second order weak tie connections, et cetera, that we'd taken for granted. And so we had to create this sort of network model on top of this networked issue that we were facing, right? And so we sort of layered on top of this. Our sort of catchphrase became, we need to become a network to fight a network. That sort of thinking. And as a result of that, the communication model inside of this had to change dramatically. And the punchline is essentially we went from what was over here a very normal sort of weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual communication cycle like any other big industry into a very rapid 24/7 cycle of information exchange, because that's how fast our adversary network was exchanging information and changing. And so I can bore you to tears with how we evolved to that. But at the end, what it looked like was 7 days a week, 24/7 cycles. We were communicating just like this in a remote sort of virtual environment. At first, it was a traditional sort of, here's the bosses, tell them what they need to know. Then the bosses realized, like, I don't know what I need to know. Actually, I need you all to drive this meeting, because I need to hear from you what's actually happening on the ground, because I can't see it fast enough to ask the right questions. And so it became this sort of bottom up conversation, much like you would find in a high trust small team. But one of the very smart things that the leaders decided to do was open this up. Let's get more and more voices in here, because we think they have access to the right information and we want that bottom up feed. What that led to was the traditional team leader who grew up in my world, looked a lot like me, et cetera, going, oh, well, if you want to know what's really going on, here's Shay, our civilian intel analyst. She's the only one that really understands this particular part of the problem. And do that on scale. And suddenly there were thousands of new types of voices in this daily sync. And if you flipped a switch from day one to year 6 in this evolution, the sort of Hollywood squares looked massively different, because it was all these leaders on the ground going, I don't know the answer either. Like, let's get in all these other voices. And it happened in such an organic way that we weren't super aware of it. But looking back in hindsight, we created this very inclusive and, as a result, diverse model and how we were looking at the information. So anyway, it was that sort of discipline around communication and the willingness to include all those other voices, I think, that got us to an end state we hadn't anticipated.